So Mr. Martin quietly enters my personal finance class. I see him hand an early copy of this book to my teacher. They shake hands, and then Mr. Martin leaves. How cool is that? In this video, I will be reviewing the sequel to Shadow of Okeaous, Scourge of the Fallen. Yes, we all know how sequels go, but when I read this book, I was impressed. And I actually thought it was better than its predecessor. And that's super rare for any book or movie, but Scourge of the Fallen is a pleasant surprise, to say the least. Now, I want to cover this book a little bit more in depth than Shadow of Okeaous just because it contains a more complex story than its predecessor. I'll be discussing the storyline and the character development, and then I'll end with some of my additional thoughts on Scourge of the Fallen. Now, this book contains a much more complex plot than Shadow of Okeaous, which gives it a very different feel overall. I thought the arrangement of events felt a little more balanced this time around. What I mean by that is that Shadow of Okeaous felt relatively calm for the first half of the book, and then it abruptly switches to a very intense second half. Now, Scourge of the Fallen seems to have mixed the calmer scenes in with the intense ones. This is actually a good thing in my opinion because it keeps the reader interested with a more calm scene or a more humorous scene that the reader can use as a mental break from whatever battle or intense training session has occurred. Because the plot is more dense in this book, the story is told through more than one viewpoint. In Shadow of Okeaous, the main character, Maggie, was the primary viewer for most of the events throughout the story, whereas this book can switch between three main viewpoints at a time during the more intense and complex parts of the story. With more perspectives comes more characters, and I'll touch more on that shortly. But I do think that this book feels more interesting with all of the new perspectives that come into play. Probably the most interesting and unexpected part of Scourge of the Fallen is the introduction of the Void, which actually gets its own sub-story to coincide with the main story. And yes, the Void is part of the subtitle for this book, and I actually thought it interesting that both this book and Shadow of Okeaous had subtitles. It's not something that I've seen very often in books, so I think it's cool that we see them here. They even give a little hint into the story, so it was a cool moment for me whenever I got to the part of the story that the subtitle was referencing. I think it will be the same for you too. Probably my favorite part of this story as a whole is the character development that is seen throughout. Both the main and supporting characters are met with more difficult situations and some threatening circumstances, and much like reality, their true colors are revealed when forced into these deadly scenarios. We immediately see how the characters have grown from the Battle of the Stone in the last book. We're greeted with a much more upbeat Maggie, who actually uses less sarcasm than her totem, Elliot. Remember, Elliot didn't understand sarcasm for most of the first book. We're also surprised by a more respectful Lucy, at least more respectful to Maggie. It is now very clear that Lucy has a crush on Thomas, and he has a crush on her. She is still a jerk to almost everyone else though, so let's just say minimal progress has been made. She did receive a very significant role towards the end of the story. And that surprised me a lot. That was very cool to read about. Good job, Martins. The introduction of a few new characters like Luke, Jerica, and Muriel was also nice to see. And I hope the next book will show their progression not only as characters, but as influences in the story. I don't want to spoil too much for those of you that haven't read this yet, but I thought the new Fancy Arm was amazing. That, along with many other new kindred abilities in this book, are fascinating to read about. Good job, Martin family. You guys keep hitting out of the ballpark with these books. There are a few extra things I want to say about Scourge of the Fallen. Not only did I see an early copy of this book, Mr. Martin showed me a picture of the cover art for this book when I first talked to him. I didn't give much verbal attention to this in the last review, but the artwork on both of these books is phenomenal. Well done, Anka Gabriella. Your work is amazing. These are the only two illustrations we have of Maggie Bennett, at least to my knowledge. But the descriptions in both books are clear, so it's not too hard to imagine how most things look in the realm of the kindred. While Shadow of Okeaous kept me up a night, this book actually kept me up a morning, both times that I've read it. I woke up and opened the book, and it happened to be close to the Battle of the Temple, where I had left off the night before. I was hooked with the same thrill as with the Battle of the Stone, so I blazed through these chapters and got a rather late start to the day afterward.
Dude, the thing has a glossary? That's awesome. It's like the appendix of Lord of the Rings. I'm going to have to read that. Clearly not right now. I need to get up and get ready.
I think both these books have insane potential for their age, and I have high hopes for the third book that will complete the Fallen trilogy. If it's as good as these two books have been, this trilogy could be placed among giants like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. These books are so unique to modern fantasy, and that is their greatest strength. I want to thank the Martin family again for bringing these stories to fantasy lovers like me. You've created a special universe, and I hope more enthusiasts come to discover it and read it. I thank all of you for watching this video, and always remember, even if we can only imagine it, we are more than one. We are kindred.